welcome to all of you for being here. I am so happy to see so many people here, and I know that Angèle and Zoe and Jeff, all of us are just as excited. We're here today to discuss and learn from one another about digital ethnography broadly, and about Angèle Christin's new book specifically. I will introduce everyone in a moment, but first let me just lay out some of the protocols for how we're going to run this session. So first, as you can see in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, we are recording this event. We hope to make it available to people after the session through the LSE and Rutgers, and maybe also through Stanford. So we'll keep you posted on where that link might be available for you and for others. As you also noted, I've turned on the live transcription for those of you who prefer to have a written version of what's taking place. Just about the Q&A, let me give you sort of an overview of how things are going to run. So Angèle is going to present for about 15 or 20 minutes. And then Zoë Glatt and Jeff Lane are going to conduct a kind of interview live with a series of questions that they've developed. And then we'll open it up to the floor. I will be moderating the chat and I'll be moderating the Q&A. So you can feel free to either put questions in the chat as you think of them, and I'm happy to read those questions for you. I'll monitor and try to ask them in the order they appear. Or during the Q&A, you're also welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question if you prefer to ask the question yourself. We understand, so just about your cameras, of course, there are all kinds of reasons you might not want to have your camera on during the event, and of course that's fine. If at all possible, if you do decide to ask a live question, perhaps at that time you could turn on your camera, just so Angèle can exchange with you, if at all possible, but if not, we understand then too. Okay, and now let me just turn to the team who is hosting and facilitating this event. So I'm going to start with Zoë Glatt, who is a digital anthropologist and feminist researcher with interest in platformized creative industries, labor, and social media culture. She's a PhD researcher in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics, where she is conducting an ethnographic study of YouTube content creators and the influencer industry. She's also the co-founder of the LSE Digital Ethnography Collective, which is one of the two sponsors of today's event. Next, Jeff Lane, an assistant professor of communication at Rutgers University in New Jersey in the US. Jeff studies communication and technology as it relates to urban life, criminal justice, and social inequalities. And he approaches these topics through ethnography in person and online. He's the author of the book, The Digital Street, published by Oxford University Press in 2019, which is a neighborhood study of social media use in Harlem in New York City. And he's now studying the role of social media as evidence in criminal court, gender and school discipline, and visual inequalities in perceptions of neighborhood space. He's also the co-founder and co-chair of the Digital Ethnography Working Group at Rutgers, popularly known as DEWG. My name is Melissa Aronczyk. I'm the other co-chair of the Digital Ethnography Working Group at Rutgers. I'm also an associate professor of media studies here at Rutgers. And I have a new book coming out from Oxford University Press, co-authored with Maria Espinoza, that uses some ethnographic techniques. It's called A Strategic Nature, Public Relations, and the Politics of American Environmentalism. Now, of course, let me introduce Angèle Christin, who will be talking with all of us about her book today. Angèle is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and affiliated faculty in the Sociology Department and program in Science, Technology, and Society at Stanford University in California. She studies how algorithms and analytics transform professional values, expertise, and work practices. And her book, Metrics at Work, Journalism and the Contested Meaning of Algorithms, which is just out from Princeton University Press, focuses on the case of web journalism. It analyzes the growing importance of audience data in web newsrooms in the US and France, And it draws very strongly on ethnographic methods. Angèle shows how American and French journalists make sense of traffic numbers in different ways, which in turn has distinct effects on the production of news in the two countries. She's also working on a new project which examines the paradoxes of algorithmic labor through a study of influencers and influencer marketing on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. So let me now cede the floor to Angèle. We're so happy that you've joined us today, and we're really looking forward to hearing about your book.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for this introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here, and it's also such a pleasure to talk about methods, right? It's like it's a kind of like nasty little thing of like academic, like methods. That's delicious, and especially ethnographers, and especially I think ethnographers who study technology using technology, right? And so I'm just really excited to be here and really excited to see everybody who's come today. And I hope that we can have a great discussion about this. So as a way to kind of start the discussion, we talked with Jeff and Zoe and Melissa to kind of start perhaps with a short presentation of the book, and then kind of open it up to first like structured questions, and then like a more open Q&A. And I really hope that everybody in the audience will kind of participate, because I think that we're all kind of struggling, or we're all figuring out how to do digital ethnography these days. And so we're kind of all doing this at the same time. So, that would be great. Okay, so I'm going to start sharing a PowerPoint as needed. Okay. So let me tell you perhaps a tiny bit to start about the book and about the role of methods in the book. So really the impetus for my book, which was just published by Princeton University Press, is a question of digital metrics. So now, when we spend time on our screens, and right now, especially in the era of social distancing, we spend so much time on our screens, right? We spend so much time on our screens that we kind of forget that the metrics are omnipresent and ubiquitous when we look at screens. Like even right now, I can see the number of participants, I can see the number of comments. There is no kind of like button, which is probably good for everybody because it would be a bit stressful. But we kind of see these metrics in real time. We see the likes, we see the shares, we see the retweets, we see the number of clicks, the number of messages, we see what's trending, what's buzzing, what's doing well on social media. And I think that we see these metrics so much that we kind of tend to forget about them. We tend to not pay attention to them. Or if we do pay attention to them, most of the time, the way we do it is like, oh, these are just vanity metrics, right? It's just like me paying attention to the number of likes is not a particularly noble kind of impulse, and it's really about me getting a kind of ego boost. Or if we are more kind of on the critical kind of social science side, we think like Shoshana Zuboff type, surveillance capitalism, we're being kind of pushed and incentivized to engage, and then we're being tracked through these metrics that are then kind of embedded within the kind of machine learning algorithms that sustain most of the social media platforms that we are using. And so what I'm trying to do in the book is really step back. The main question that drives the book is stepping back from these kind of somewhat simplistic, I think, views of the kind of work that metrics accomplishes. And instead I ask, what is the role of metrics as symbolic and cultural resources? What is the kind of work that they do? And how do they change the kind of world we live in? So that's really the question that drives the book. And I explore it by looking at the case of journalism. So journalism, when we think of journalism, we typically have images, something like this, right? So very white, very male, the typewriter, the cigarettes, the hat, that's the kind of like kind of stock picture description that you have of journalism. It's also, this description comes with this idea that you have like major headlines, right? The atomic bomb headlines that really change the kind of world we live in. The third aspect of that kind of traditional description of journalism is the idea of mass media. And that's, I guess, the third picture, which is that, you have a handful of journalists come from specific socio-demographic backgrounds, specific social classes, specific elite kind of sectors of society that shapes the message for the masses, and the masses don't speak back, right? They have no way of speaking back to the people who are developing the message. And so that's the businessmen reading the newspapers in the train. Of course, journalism doesn't look like that so much today. Over the past 30 years, starting in the late 1990s, journalism has moved online. And as news production became primarily digital, multiple changes took place. Multimedia production, interactive articles, robot journalism, a diversification of the journalistic profession. So many changes have taken place over the past 30 years. But what's more important for my purpose is the fact that over the past 20 years, journalists started paying close attention to what their online readers were doing. And they pay close attention to what online readers are doing through typically this kind of software program. So this is Chartbeat. It's a software program that provides real-time analytics about what readers are doing on any given web page, on any given website at any given moment. And so you can see that there is kind of a dial on the upper left corner, then you have a ranking of the articles, and then you have just a lot of data about what readers are doing, where they come from, how long they spend on each page. You can see on the top left that the engage time is on average under 1 minute on each article, which is usually kind of depressing for the journalists involved who are like, what 1 minute? But I spent 2 weeks writing that article, what's going on? And so typically these metrics are used right now in news organizations for two different types of purposes. The first kind of purpose is economic, and typically marketing departments use very detailed metrics, not these ones specifically, but similar ones, to kind of figure out how to negotiate ad rates with brands, right? And basically to sell kind of online advertising and make a profit that way. But these metrics are also used for editorial uses, and that's the kind of uses that I'm going to be focusing on, which is that these programs like Chartbeat are now used in every single, not every single, but most newsrooms, and they are on every single journalist's computer, and they have access to the metrics basically as a way to kind of bridge the gap between the production of information and the consumption of information. And the idea, that's what Chartbeat kind of aims to do, and I know that Caitlin Petrie is here, I saw her name, and so that's something that she studied so well. One of the things that Chartbeat aims to do is really kind of bridge this gap and put the audience at the center of web newsrooms. Okay, so this is kind of the situation. Given the omnipresence, the ubiquity of these kinds of digital metrics in the news production process, how can we analyze these effects? So far, and I think until kind of a new generation of scholars started kind of studying this, and Caitlin is definitely kind of there as well, I think that most of the framing, I mean, the dominant framing was, well, having these metrics necessarily comes with clickbait. Right? Having these metrics creates bad incentives for journalists and editors to try to maximize traffic and not kind of pay attention or not care as much about the quality of the articles that they're putting out, instead really caring only about clicks with this kind of headlines: man tries to hug a white lion, you won't believe what happens next. And so a lot of the ways in which these kind of metrics have been theorized until now has been this kind of, oh, you know, this is clickbait, this is the lowest common denominator, and it's just really bad. And so I came to this question really as a cultural sociologist and asked instead, so is it really what's going on when you pay attention to newsrooms? And how do web journalists concretely use and make sense of these traffic metrics? And how does it change their professional identities and professional practices? So basically trying to unpack this idea of clickbait, right? And to be like, so what is there? And so that's where I decided to spend time in newsrooms to figure out how these kind of dynamics played out. So I'm an ethnographer by training. I'm also French. Usually it's pretty clear from my name and accent. And so what I decided to do is to kind of do a kind of comparative ethnography in New York and in Paris, with the idea being like, well, so if we have this pressure towards clickbait, how does it play out depending on the context, right? And how does it play out when you compare newsrooms and journalistic traditions that are very different? And I'll come back to that in a tiny bit, but basically the United States and France, for a range of reasons, are typically kind of compared as being just very different in how they conceptualize the media, journalism, intellectuals, and how they respond to market pressures. So what I did there between 2011 and 2015 was to spend a lot of time in several newsrooms, but I ended up focusing on two newsrooms that I call the Notebook in New York and La Place in Paris. And I'm happy to talk more about how I picked the newsrooms, but basically they have lots of features in common and they even knew each other. And in fact, the French newsroom wanted to be the French version of the American newsroom. So there was this kind of built-in convergence going on there. And so as part of this project, I spent a lot of time in these two newsrooms, basically sitting in, you have a little description of the two kind of open spaces there, sitting with a journalist, sitting behind them, looking at what they were doing on their screens, kind of following them as they were doing interviews, as they were writing, as they were taking coffee breaks, lunch breaks, cigarette breaks, drink breaks, whatever, all kinds of breaks. Journalists take a lot of breaks. Breaks are very important in actually making journalism happen, which is not that different from academics, I guess. And so just doing that. In parallel to this kind of offline fieldwork, right, where I was just in person, in the newsroom, figuring out what was going on, I was also doing a lot of online fieldwork. And that was kind of a surprise because I wasn't necessarily trained that much in kind of digital or STS kind of techniques. But I realized that, you know, the web journalists that I studied cared a lot about online dynamics. And so a lot of their exchanges were taking place on group chats, different kind of collective channels, on Twitter, on other social media platforms, and that just this was a significant part of the world they were living in. Even though it wasn't at that time part of my world, I kind of followed them there and started kind of tracking and following and just trying to understand how these online interactions were taking place. So kind of moving between this online and this offline kind of type of ethnographic material. So based on this fieldwork in New York and Paris, what did I find regarding audience metrics? Basically, the way I kind of summarize it is this kind of process of divergence within convergence. And so I'm going to start on the convergence side before talking briefly about the divergence side. So the convergence side is basically, yes, there is clickbait. There is a pressure to maximize traffic in newsrooms. And that's the case both in the US and in France. So basically, kind of spending time in the two newsrooms, doing interviews, etc. What I found was many similarities between these two websites that I call the Notebook and La Place. On the first hand, what happened was that the two websites had very similar evolutions over time. In both cases, they started kind of in the mid-2000s with a kind of utopian desire to really change the news, right? They were like, we're going to take advantage of the internet. It's this kind of utopian kind of democratic force. We're going to interact with readers. We're not going to have hierarchies. It's going to be like kind of utopia on the in cyberland, right? Which is something that my colleague Fred Turner has been analyzing quite a bit. And I really found this utopian desire in the two newsrooms that I studied. At the same time, the two newsrooms that I studied also felt the lid kind of closing back in, basically around 2009, 2010, when suddenly, for a range of different reasons, traffic took center stage. And traffic concerns started to be basically dominant in the life of the two newsrooms. And so there are a range of reasons, right? Social media platforms became much more important and they were driving readers to the websites and driving advertising revenues much more than before. There were new kind of players in the journalistic fields that had aggressive traffic strategies, mostly the Huffington Post and BuzzFeed that kind of arrived at that moment. And so they kind of realigned the traffic kind of imperatives, right? And just made everybody much more traffic conscious. And last but not least, the two parent companies of these websites that I studied were like, okay, we let you play for a bit. And this was really fun. Now we want money. and we want to increase our advertising footprint, and we want traffic, and you're going to bring these eyeballs to us. And so the two newsrooms that I studied, I really felt during the time of my fieldwork, suddenly the kind of click-based pressure kind of coming in and really bringing kind of everybody under very strongly in the two places. Unsurprisingly, what I also found is that these evolutions led the two newsrooms to adopt similar practices over time. So first, they started using Chartbeats, the software programs that I showed a bit earlier, at the same time in the two newsrooms, right? So independently, they were just like, oh, this is a tool that we need. We're going to license it and we're going to use it. And so I saw them kind of become kind of addicted to Chartbeat, or at least I saw Chartbeat becoming a much more important part of the daily life of the journalists and editors in the two cases. But more broadly, what I found in the two newsrooms is that in both cases, there was this kind of acute and almost palpable tension between different ways of defining what they were doing. And I call these two ways of defining what they were doing an editorial evaluation and a click-based evaluation. And so basically, that's kind of what you would expect, right? But a bit more complicated, I think, in the sense that the kind of editorial evaluation is really like, oh, I'm a journalist because I want to write great articles that are going to change our perception of the world, that are going to break news, that are going to make an impact, and that my colleagues are really going to love and care about. And here, what matters the most is to get the respect of your colleagues and superiors, right? And to spend time to do good journalistic work, to really put the kind of the kind of data in to kind of bring original information or an original angle. That kind of definition of journalism was kind of always, all the time, for everybody, kind of in tension with the click-based definition of what they were doing, where really what mattered was not so much to do great journalism, it was to resonate with the public, right? Resonate with the audience and kind of engage in that act of communication with online readers. And concretely, what this means is that what really mattered was to go viral, to trend, to be making a buzz, to have everybody talk about your article, because it meant that you had captured the vibe of the day, right? That you were surfing on what these kind of distributed readers wanted to read about. It came with new editorial formats such as slideshows, quizzes, listicles, all of these kind of funny, kind of clickable articles and headlines that you see and that you want to click on. And really, it was primarily about communicating with this online audience, and communication process that could be measured and assessed through quantitative metrics, right? And that's where the clicks, the likes, the trending, the retweets, etc. Really mattered. And so what I found was that journalists and editors keep switching back and forth between these two ways of defining what they were doing. It's like, oh, my article didn't get a lot of clicks, but why? Oh, but you know, and then a colleague would come and would say, no, your article was really good. I liked it. And at the end of the day, that's what matters. And then the journalist would be like, well, yeah, but like only 2,000 people clicked. So like, you know, what's the point even? And so you would have this like very explicit kind of discussions about what are the criteria that matter, right? How do we value what we do? And a kind of tension between these two things, both in New York and in Paris. So that's the convergent side. But at the same time, as I spend more time in the two newsrooms, I also realized that there were strong differences between how the New York and the Parisian newsrooms were handling and interpreting metrics. So basically, the way I kind of think about it is as a two-layered kind of set of divergence. So the first layer is a kind of internal kind of power dynamic in the newsrooms. And there what I found was that depending on the newsroom, metrics were put to very different kinds of uses, right? So in the New York newsroom, I identified what I call the bureaucratic system, where it was basically like a Fordist factory, right? You had very clear hierarchies and basically a very strong division of labor between editors and journalists and different kinds of journalists. And depending on your position in that hierarchy, you would have different responsibilities regarding metrics, which what that meant was that typically metrics were the realm of top editors. top editors were in charge of maximizing metrics. And the idea was that staff writers did not have to deal with metrics. They still knew about their metrics, right? They still knew the number of clicks, but they were like, listen, I don't really care about this. What I care about is to write great articles. So using the kind of editorial mode of evaluation, because at the end of the day, that's what's gonna get me promoted. That's what's going to get me a better job in the future. It's not the number of clicks, because people have bad taste and they're always going to click on an article on, whatever, Rihanna or Beyonce or something, or a sex scandal, or, some things that, whatever. It doesn't say anything about my work and my quality as a journalist. So that was kind of the New York kind of newsroom. In the French newsroom, things were pretty different in the sense that there wasn't this kind of like, Fordist type structure. Instead, it was a very flat hierarchy where everybody was doing a bit of everything. They often kind of described themselves as like a group of friends or a gang or like a tribe, right? They kept using this kind of idea of like flat hierarchies as a way to describe what they were doing. But what that meant is that no one was specifically responsible for metrics. And as a result, everybody was kind of obsessed with metrics. And so that's kind of what I found during my time in that newsroom, which is that they kept talking about Chartbeat. And you would see that they had kind of internalized in a very kind of Foucauldian disciplinary way, the pressure to get good traffic numbers. It would be like, oh, like, I don't know, like I didn't get I didn't get a high number of clicks yesterday. People didn't click. I think the editor-in-chief is not gonna like me. I think they're gonna think that I've lost it, that I'm just not good at my job anymore. So this kind of like very strong internalization of the pressure to get metrics, right? Which to some extent is due to the absence of division of labor in that newsroom. So that's the first layer. But the second layer is something that I kind of worked on really, and that was kind of a key part of the book project, was also that more profoundly, the journalists in the two newsrooms did not see the same thing when they were looking at metrics. And so that was my like aha moment. It's like, wow, they don't see the same thing. For the American journalists, metrics are really about market pressures. And as such, well, if you're the editor-in-chief, well, then you have to deal with market pressures, and that's your job. And that's why, in their world, you're paid the big bucks, right? That's what you have to do. That's your responsibility as a manager. But for journalists, they were like, no, listen, these market pressures, journalism has been dealing with this for a long time. The penny press, big media, whatever, the media monopoly. You know what? I don't want to deal with this. My job is to work on writing good articles, and I just don't want to deal with metrics. So like kind of putting them at bay as like something external that was being imposed on them and that they did not want to deal with, right? Whereas for the French journalist, and that's the part that's like really kind of interesting for me, especially because I keep thinking about academia in the back of my head. For French journalists, metrics, yes, were about market pressures, and as such they were criticized in a very French way, saying like, oh, it's like prostitution, I don't want to sell myself, this is really dirty, whatever. Very interesting gendered metaphors there, usually coming from male journalists. So anyways, there was a whole thing to unpack there. But basically at the end of the day, for the French journalists, metrics also say something about their resonance in the public sphere, right? They're kind of relevant to the public. And here we can go back to the beginning of journalism in the late 19th century in France, where the role of journalists in France is really to guide the nation. Going back to the Dreyfus affair and kind of big scandals like that, journalists see themselves as intellectuals in charge of shaping public opinion. And so if no one reads your articles, then you're not shaping public opinion, you're doing a bad job, right? And so metrics were this kind of like multifaceted and complicated indicator, both of market pressures, but also of this kind of algorithmic public sphere, or what I call algorithmic publics, so publics that are both mediated and represented through algorithmic procedures. And so, to kind of make sense of these different, not only uses, but also visions, right, of what metrics are about, I kind of mobilize a framework in terms of journalistic traditions and national fields, and I'm happy to talk more about that, but basically just saying, listen, journalism as an occupation, an industry, and a kind of identity has a very different history in the two national contexts, and we need to pay attention to this to understand how journalists make sense of metrics. So I've talked so far somewhat primarily about organizational dynamics, but I just want to add like one little point also because it gives me a chance to talk about my new project, which I'm like kind of giddily excited about. So I can't help it, about individual identities. So when we think about metrics, so far I talked about division of labor, editors and journalists, professional identities, etc. But what was really striking, spending time with journalists, and especially I will say with precarious freelancers, which constitute a big part of my sample, just because it's very hard to get a full-time job in journalism these days, and so many of them had been, or would be freelancers at some point. It's again similarities with academia are striking. That they kept talking about that number of Twitter followers. They kept talking about their metrics, and especially their Twitter metrics. And basically, the way they would put it is like, listen, my number of followers on Twitter, it gives people a sense of my personal brand, right? It gives people a sense of my footprint, of like how many people I can affect. And basically they kept saying like, yeah, it's really important to get a high number of Twitter followers because then I can negotiate higher rates with the publications I work with, because they know that my followers on Twitter are going to click, and so it's going to bring them advertising revenues, and therefore I can charge more. By the way, this was not really confirmed by any editor I talked to, but the freelancers were like adamant about it. They were like, yes, more Twitter followers means that it's a symbol of prestige, and it's a symbol of like kind of importance in the journalistic field, and so I can charge more for my freelance pieces. And so for me, that was really interesting, just as a sense of how metrics are now shaping our subjectivities, right? And our sense of self in this very individual way. And of course, Zoe can see where I'm going there, which is that, the parallel with influencers is very striking. That, in the age of platforms, our subjectivities and our professional identities are very much shaped by the number of followers that we have and how we interact with these kind of online collectives that we gather around our personal brand. So something to just think about. So to conclude the discussion and kind of transition into the Q&A, just perhaps 3 points to kind of, get perhaps some of the discussion started. So the first one is, how do we understand online news production in the age of platforms, right? And so I think that there are a couple of points there that I would like to make, because I think they're important. The first one is, if there is one lesson to take from this book, it's just that it's not just clickbait. Clickbait is not really the problem. Metrics, in fact, are not really the problem. Really, the problem is not audience metrics per se. It's more how they're enrolled, how they're mobilized within organizational, professional, field, economic dynamics, right? And that's where things get tricky. But, in a way, metrics are, they're not really the problem, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And it's not all clickbait and, kind of spiraling towards the lowest common denominator and the end of quality news. It's much more complicated than that. Similarly, when we think about the roles that kind of online readers and online publics, what I call algorithmic publics, are playing in shaping news production, again, I want to push back against some of the current kind of framings in terms of like cancel culture or like, disinformation, like all of these like pretty kind of simplistic, I think, ways of understanding what happens within this kind of algorithmic collectives that kind of get both kind of mediated and come together through algorithmic procedures and are represented in the same way. And so that's, I think, what I'm trying to like get into with this new project, kind of looking at the new forms of authority that takes place at this kind of intersection between content or news production. I think most journalists would be very annoyed if I said that they were doing content production, but content production basically, and kind of algorithmic publics, and kind of figuring out what's the back and forth there, right? What's going on there, and how is power and authority renegotiated in these spaces? The second point is kind of my, one of my rants. So apologies for this. But, so there has been a lot of backlash against tech companies for very good reasons, and kind of algorithms and artificial intelligence and however you want to call it. And I think that there are very good points there that are being made, and very important points about how these procedures are biased. But I want to call attention to the fact that you know, in many cases, the power of these technological tools is kind of taken for granted and never interrogated. What I've been calling kind of algorithmic determinism, right? That like we assume that because there is an algorithm out there that's doing bad stuff, it's gonna have terrible effects. And I think that here through this work and some of my other work that I've been doing on criminal justice and a bunch of other sites, I really kind of call for in-depth studies of how these tools are used and how they're put into practice, and what are some of the kind of fine-grained kind of dynamics that take place there. Thinking, you know, basically that in most cases, what happens on the ground doesn't necessarily match what the designers of the algorithms or the metrics or the platforms were thinking would happen, right? And so that's actually a great segue into my last point, which is that for that, we need ethnographic methods. And we need ethnographic methods because that's basically the best way to kind of pay attention to what happens on the ground, right? What happens when people are using technology, are putting them to their own uses, to their own priorities, to their own logics, and some of the unintended consequences, both good, that would be like resistance, yay, like, you know, but also bad. For example, in many cases, I find that, you know, especially in the case of criminal justice, you know, the way in which people use the algorithms in the criminal courts makes them kind of worse. So, you know, both good or bad, but basically kind of changing the actual impact of these technologies within kind of daily kind of context and daily uses. And so that, I think, this kind of, you know, role of ethnographic methods and the fact that we have to keep doing ethnography, even on algorithms and algorithmic systems that seem very complicated, massive, disconnected, whatever, is super important. But it also calls for a rethinking of the ethnographic canon in a way. And that's a discussion that I've had with Jeff like over the years, that I think, and with Forrest Stewart and a bunch of other people, that I think ethnographic methods were really originally designed to study, you know, very kind of clearly bounded communities, urban communities. You know, there are like a couple of like gold standards of ethnography, right? And that we need to like kind of step out of these standards and rethink what it means to gather ethnographic knowledge in a world mediated by digital technologies. And so I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Angèle. It's really very useful. I have like 9,000 questions already, but it's not my turn yet. I'm going to turn now to Jeff Lane and Zoë Glatt, who have prepared some questions and comments for Angèle, and then I think that'll be about half an hour or so, and then at the following that, we'll have an open Q&A with everybody. So Zoë and Jeff, take it away.
Yeah, wow, thank you. I find myself doing this at the end of talks on Zoom. It's a bit weird, isn't it? Performative. We did write some questions, but as we predicted, I now have lots of new questions. But thank you, that was great. You covered so much ground in terms of what you cover in the book in that talk, which was nice. Do you mind if I go first, Jeff?
Shoot, do it.
Shoot. Okay. Oh, where to even start? I mean, I guess I'm interested to know or hear more about your point at the end, which is to do with something I've thought about a lot as well, which is to do with kind of, I guess, power and agency when it comes to algorithmic systems. Did you find in your research that journalists, either as individuals or in terms of organizations, felt that they had agency to actually change conversations, or did they find that they kind of had to fit in with the rationales of metrics or whatever in order to be visible? Because I feel like we have the same, like you said, it's very similar in the influencer industry. Like I've seen content creators often grapple with wanting to shape the conversation, but then also having quite a good idea of what wouldn't be popular, and therefore like it wouldn't be seen by anyone, and that whole point about like, well, what's the point of saying it if no one is listening, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I think, you know, so that's where like, so first, like I think journalists are just such a funny crowd, right? And of course, like everybody's a funny crowd, but like, you know, they kind of think that they know better. They have a bit of a superiority complex in many cases, which, you know, they are shaping some version of public discourse. So there is that. So basically, yeah, so what was interesting is that I think individually, they all felt, so that was kind of super interesting actually, they all felt that they weren't struggling with metrics that much, that other people were struggling with metrics, right? So it was always like, no, I'm fine, but like over there, yeah, they're really struggling. And so, you know, you hear that like 50 times in a row, you're like, okay, you guys have a problem with metrics, I'm sorry. So typically, the ways I would put it was, you know what, so typically about this kind of click-based versus editorial evaluation, they would say like, well, you know, what you really want is to do both. So you want to like have a really important journalistic article, but wrapped in a way that's gonna attract the attention of people, right? And so they would always mobilize these best case scenarios, right, of articles that both were making important point and were also doing really well in terms of traffic. And that's always when asked kind of point blank about like, you know, about like how much flexibility, how much kind of margin of maneuvers they had, they would always point to these best case scenarios, which like, I just think is so interesting how so many people, you know, when faced with a continuum, will always pick like the best case thing. And you're like, yeah, that happens like once every 100 times, right? But somehow that was kind of fallback option. So then what I did find though, is that, you know, for sure, I did find some journalists who had a bit of a different vision of metrics. So typically, I'm thinking, for example, of a journalist who was really focusing on labor and kind of unions. And that was really her beat. She cared a lot about kind of worker organizing and labor organizing. And basically what she kind of had figured out was that instead of caring about clicks in general, what she cared about was talking to her community. And that's where like the parallel with influencers is so interesting, right? She was like, listen, I don't really care about getting like tens of thousands of clicks or likes or whatever. What I want is the people I'm writing for, which is a specific subgroup of labor activists, union organizers, you know, etc. How that kind of, how they react to what I write. So trying to think about more qualitative metrics in a way, right? And paying a lot of attention to the comments, responding to the comments, etc. And so I will say is that I've seen that in like across the board on both sides of the Atlantic, that journalists basically, one way in which they would deal with metrics and kind of make them their own or reclaim agency, right, was to kind of define their own metrics. And typically that would mean writing for a specific subgroup of the audience and saying, that's my goal, that's my impact, that's what I care about. Which of course, again, the parallel with influencers is just very striking.
Also quite striking with academics. It's like, who follows you on Twitter? Is it the people that you care about following you, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. And same thing, I mean, I think that, you know, it's the same thing with, again, the parallels with academia are so striking, but I think it's like, you know, so, you know, it's like, for example, comparing the number of downloads of an article to the number of citations, right? Both metrics being like equally faulty and problematic, but they do kind of point out towards different things. So anyway, so it's just kind of interesting.
Interesting.
You know, to follow up with that, Angèle, and where you kind of left us in your presentation, which was obviously phenomenal. So thank you. You know, so what do we, you know, what are some of like the lessons about online metrics beyond journalism and the lessons for ethnography? Like you sort of mentioned that we might need some new routines if we want to adjust to field sites where metrics are present, and to pick up the kind of complexity and diversity of meanings of metrics for both specific individuals and organizations. And you know, in your talk, there were examples where I mean, you started out saying metrics actually don't even matter that much because half the time it's just taken for granted, so it just fades into the background. And then you sort of talked about, you know, examples where metrics are really important. You talked about metric-based identities, but then you said, well, actually, they're really metric-based identities in these very sort of individual, peculiar ways, or different, you know, different ways. So I guess, you know, what can ethnography sort of offer online metrics, or the study of online metrics? Where do online metrics kind of fit in our field sites? What are the costs of studying online metrics without ethnography if we don't do it with ethnography? And how do we make sure we're not sort of getting co-opted by these metrics and only speaking to the people with the highest, counts. And that's always a problem for ethnography, that we end up sometimes talking to the people who are the most publicly visible, the most out there, the most willing to tell their stories and want to bring us into their storytelling process. How do we deal with metrics in the field site?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, so I have several answers. I think so. Okay, so like, and Jeff, I mean, we've known each other for a long time. We were in grad school together, so I feel like that's like one of the great parts of grad school, which is that you get to see kind of people grow intellectually and in all these different ways. But I think that, what's interesting is that we were both trained as very kind of traditional ethnographers, right? That in like, oh, you really need to like, it's a kind of mystique of the field, right? It's like you have to be in the field and you have to be there every day and you have to like just do it all the time and you have to become a different person. And I think that for me, like what's interesting about, about that is, well, double things. The first one is that like, it's basically metrics kind of emerge from the field, right? As these things that like everybody was paying attention to. And so I kind of followed them there. And so I think that for me, at the end of the day, it's kind of the lesson of ethnography, which is like you arrived with your kind of preconceived, like whatever, with your research questions. And then you're like, actually, people don't care at all about that. They don't give a damn about this. So what do I do now? Like, and usually what you do is you kind of ditch your original research question. Oh, I mean, you can also stick to it. That's also a valid approach. But like, and you're just like, okay, so what do they care about? And so I think that that's interesting. But it also plays out with metrics in different ways. As it like, I can imagine lots of cases where people don't care specifically about metrics, right? So kind of thinking about that. But I will say, and you're right, that like, I think that with our kind of platformed lives, right? Or with the fact that we spend more and more time through this kind of platform processes, regardless of how you want to call them, where metrics are just so essential. They're essential like in a technological way, right? It's like code is metrics, like at deep down, like that's what code does, right? It's just turns things into zeros and ones. That's kind of what happens. But also because of the kind of whole like monetization based kind of advertising models that like platforms want engagement. And to get engagement, they give you a carrot and a stick. And the carrot is the clicks and the kind of metrics that you get. And so I think that as soon as you study kind of platform social processes, metrics are going to be kind of part and parcel of what you're doing. That said, that brings in a couple of difficulties. I mean, I think the first one is, as you say, that, the question of access is always tough because some people really want to chat and some people are not so interested in chatting. They just don't really want to do it. And so what do you do? How do you push? Like, how do you account for the kind of blind angles that you have, right, in your research? And I think that's certainly the case with metrics. And so here, for example, let me talk about my new project, which is on influencers. And so I've been doing a couple of case studies, one about YouTube drama channels with Becca Lewis, one about vegan influencers. And so the way in which we kind of we kind of came up with this kind of procedure to sample these specific subfields, right, in which we would basically create giant spreadsheets, entering all the names we could identify for either drama channels or vegan influencers. And then as we were doing this on the platforms, following YouTube's recommendation algorithm to get more names, right? And just kind of try to use the algorithm as a way to kind of saturate or like triangulate or, kind of add more stuff. But when you do that, by the same token, you're also taking the platform logic at face value, right? You're like basically taking the people that the platforms makes visible. And that's something, for example, in the case of vegan influencers that, I realized because I have like, I did all of these interviews, etc. And I kind of showed that to a vegan who agreed to read and who was very much in the digital world and agreed to read my paper and who said like, listen, all of your vegans are white. Like, this is not like, there are lots of non-white vegans. You are actually sampling like a very specific subset of vegans. And I was like, yes, absolutely. And that's because in part I used the platform itself to surface what was visible. And as we know, typically, like, platforms surface what's kind of mainstream. And in that case, mainstream was white vegans, right? And so anyway, that just really makes me think about, again, this question of triangulation. And sorry, I'm rambling, but like, I'm just really kind of thinking hard about how do we get the same depth or the same richness when we are not only studying metrics, but using platforms to study metrics, right? So when like we're just part of that whole kind of platform field, for lack of a better word. And I think that it comes with many kind of opportunities, but also a lot of kind of, blind spots that, by definition, we're all kind of figuring out right now.
Yeah. Jeff, I don't know if you had any follow-up comments. Yeah, that rings a lot of bells for me as well. The example about the kind of self-fulfilling logics of the platform, which is where I guess I find with influencers, but with anyone, I guess, any context where you're studying platform cultures, it's important to find like different methods to come at the thing from, if you know what I mean. But but the very fact that came up is a really interesting finding in and of itself. And actually, I think I saw that Chris Hine is here, who's obviously written about that. Very good piece about that. Yeah, so interesting. I am interested to hear more. I don't think you cover it much in the book. I'm interested to hear more about what happens when, and it kind of follows on from what we were just saying anyway, what happens when platforms themselves become a major player in the journalistic field, because obviously we're talking about metrics and whatever, but the ways that the metrics are driven are part of the platform design, and those are third-party platforms from the journalistic websites themselves. So I wonder how journalists understood the role of, like, I guess, big tech companies in kind of how they felt about the fact that big tech companies were had become a major conduit, or what's the word, intermediary, I suppose, between their content and the readers, how readers were being offered their content.
Yeah, so that's such an important question. I think it's an important question in two ways. First, because platform over the course of the 2000s, right? And like I stopped my fieldwork in 2015, but it had only accelerated since then, became, as you say, a major conduit. And so it's really interesting because the way journalists talk about it is that this is lateral traffic, by which they mean people who don't come to the homepage, who don't come to the website, but instead like come kind of laterally through platforms. And so the way in which so it's really interesting, the way in which journalists and editors especially kind of felt that was like as a loss of power, basically, an absolute, utter, terrible loss of power. And at the same time, as something that brought in new gaming practices. So basically what I saw over the course of my fieldwork was kind of especially social media editors developing like lots of like false theories, right? About like how to game the Facebook and the kind of YouTube and Twitter algorithms or whatever is like, anyway, platforms. And so they had like lots of kind of ways, lots of little recipes for doing it, that's kind of interesting, that then you would have this kind of mimetic isomorphism. Also newsroom would start using the same recipes, and so I analyze that in part as like the kind of like click-based evaluation, that there was this whole like, what Sophie Bishop calls algorithmic law, right? And you really saw that within kind of newsrooms in the same way that you see it among influencers, that like they all had recipes to be more visible online, and they engage in all this work of visibility that was never acknowledged, was not valued, was not typically done by women interns, kind of low level workers who just entered the newsroom to kind of yes, pivoting to video. I see that was such a, I heard that sentence so much. The two sentences that I heard the most, I think, was capitalize on traffic and pivoting to video. That was just like, I swear, like I just heard them so much. Anyway, so that's the first aspect. But I think the second aspect, which like is a bit more even mind-blowing in a way, is that news websites became a bit more like platforms over the years. And see, that's the part where I think that really platforms are transforming the industry and the kind of media industries in a profound way, which is that over the years, basically, all the news websites that I studied were like, listen, we have this gold mine. This gold mine is our readers' data. We have to exploit this. We have to use it. We have to monetize it. This is precious, right? And this is such a platformed way of thinking. It's such a big tech way of thinking. It's such a surveillance capitalism way of thinking. And I kind of saw that kind of type of logic make its way within the news websites that I studied, both in the US, where it arrived earlier, but then also in France, right? And so kind of them thinking about how do we monetize our community of readers, right? And so do we do events? Do we do like master classes? Do we kind of sell the data to advertisers? But that's kind of the lowest kind of possible thing because you don't make that much money. So how do we milk it, right? And that's just so interesting because that wasn't at all part of the original kind of mindset of kind of journalists before digital technologies and before platform came into being.
If I can jump from there, another way in which I think we're seeing the influence of platforms and metrics is in terms of the temporal structure of the work and the pacing of journalism. And I want to just ask you about that a little bit more. So you have a really cool chapter on the fast and the slow of journalistic work. And there's a lot in your book about flow and workflow, both in the sense of like journalistic activity and the pacing of projects and deadlines, but also in the more sort of qualitative, emotional sense of like the way Gary Fine or Goffman or Block would talk about it as like feeling in sync with the people around you, feeling that sort of satisfaction, that kind of crispness of like moving through your day. I mean, we're all really thinking about that a lot. There are the days where we just like feel and flow with our family and our work, and we're moving between meetings and we're writing. And then there are the days where just like, there's the exact opposite of that feeling of flow, of synchronicity, of connection. And I was thinking about that a lot in your book. And I guess I'm interested a little bit in like the sort of experiential parts of, and the emotional responses of, satisfaction, of frustration, of pressure, relative to the self, to these to the screen and the kinds of information coming off the screen, to others in the organization. When does journalistic work feel more fluid and effortless as a result? When does it feel the opposite of that and kind of out of flow? Like there's a lot on flow of the newsroom, there's a lot on flow of the individual lives of these journalists, and then it's also connected to your own flow as a field worker, working on a very different timetable and going much, very slowly probably, right? And I guess, what did you learn about the pacing of the newsroom, the pacing of your own field work that might be useful?
Yeah, that's such a good question.
To think about.
I realized that like that's actually what I end my methodological appendix on, right? Being like, it took me, so I started in 2011, we're like 2021, this is 10 years, and it's just very long. And especially compared to the journalist I studied, for whom spending 3 weeks on an article was already like this major endeavors that would arrive like a couple of times in any given year, So I think this question of temporality again, like especially as this like academia versus journalism kind of back and forth is really interesting. And I think actually this question right now is like really kind of comes up with like nostalgic undertones, where I'm just like, I just wish I could get coffees with people. Can we just all like, and so I have this kind of very vivid memories of like being in Paris, and where like, basically they would just go get coffee every 5 minutes. And so like I would spend most of my days at the coffee kind of downstairs, just, I miss coffee shop life, Matt, I do, like, anyway. brushing it off. So flow. So it's really interesting. You know, it's something that I've been thinking a lot about. And I think especially as a French academic who like then kind of moved to the US, about how American campuses, many of them, and so for people in the New York area, it's probably like an exception, but so many of them are like looking inwards and not at all looking outwards, right? And they're like segregated or like kind of remote from the city, remote from the urban life, remote from the world, really. And I remember when I first arrived at Princeton, which is just particularly like that, right? Just literally like kind of hiding from Route 1 and you know, the kind of industrial landscape and New York City all around. I was just like, how can you even do research in these spaces, right? And of course, you know, 15 years later, I don't even notice it anymore. And anyway, we don't go to campuses, so what does it even mean? But what's interesting there, and sorry, this seems meandering, but I'm getting to the question, is that newsrooms are the opposite of that. Newsrooms are like train stations. They're like open to the element. It's like you always have a ton of people coming in, coming out, going up, going down, chatting with other people. You have people coming for interviews, journalists going out for interviews. You know, basically the worst insult you could do to a journalist is say like, oh, you've been sitting at your desk all day. You know, that's the worst insult you can tell them. Like the whole things that, you know, they kept talking about, like, oh, you have to go out, you have to move your butts. That's, you know, the French ones always talking about butts, but like, you know, you have to go out, you have to talk to people, you have to experience the world. And that was just so interesting. And so I think that what I saw in the kind of newsrooms that I studied was like a shift in the kind of flow or rhythm of journalistic production. So don't get me wrong, newsrooms always had a kind of tension between the fast and the slow, which is that you have to do this kind of short, quick articles that are, you know, quick, like breaking news, agency wires, like, oh, you know, popping things out. But, and then you also have to do like more in-depth stuff. But I think that with digital technologies, the rhythm accelerated. And here, like, I'm thinking like Judy Wajman kind of stuff, right? But like that basically, in order, again, to capitalize on traffic, it's a bit like sending bottles into the ocean, right? You have to send lots of bottles. And so what a lot of the journalists I talked to kind of expressed was a sense that things were not in sync, in the sense that like they had to do so many, like what they called like HuffPost, you know, or like so many short like articles that would like create a bit of a buzz and hopefully go a bit viral, and that would react to any kind of like new things that was taking place on Twitter, that they didn't really have time to sit down and kind of write the articles or the longer things that they wanted to write. Now, I also want to say that I'm always taking these discourses with a grain of salt, in part because I feel like no matter what you study, people are always going to say like, oh, I don't have enough time. I'm sure that if you studied like academics in the late 19th century, like whatever, Max Weber would be like, you know, what's really annoying is that like there are too many pressures and I don't have enough time to write or whatever, right? So I think that to some extent this is like a kind of constant of social life. But that said, I saw that kind of like different rhythms bumping into each other, right? And journalists really struggling to kind of navigate this, like, oh, like, let me write like a 2-paragraph kind of, you know, lol kind of thing, and like trying to write that articles that I'm going to be remembered for. And, you know, I mean, I think, again, like, you know, seeing Twitter over the past 12 months, like you certainly see the same complaints from academics who are like, what am I doing on that website? Like, I should be writing. So anyway, yeah.
Well, I'll just, you know, add a quick comment too, also, that I think it has implications for the kind of relationships and the kinds of breakthroughs we're hoping to get through ethnography right now, thinking about the, you know, the flow that our participants and the people we want to study, the kinds of workflow and the kinds of, you know, just satisfactions and experience that they're having right now. And like, how do we insert ourselves in a way that allows us to achieve some of that excitement and enjoyment with them, and you know, and just, there's a kind of an openness and a kind of charismatic exchange that we hope will happen in a relationship and in an ethnographic relationship. And I think there's I'm just curious about how, you know, all of us right now doing ethnography are kind of approaching the routines of people we're studying and how we're linking up with those routines, particularly if we want to sort of get to know them in a way that's more significant than an interview, than a one-off, or than even a series of interviews.
Yeah. And I think, again, I mean, I think that, and that's, I mean, you know, and just kind of reacting to this, I think that that's the beauty and complexity of doing digital ethnography, which is that, you know, okay, so like the times when I was doing fieldwork in newsrooms were very different from my kind of day-to-day life, right? First, I would have to get out of my apartment very early, and I hate that. You know, I'm really a slow morning person, and newsrooms, you have to get there at 8 a.m. And so, you know, already the day was starting on like a somewhat traumatic note for me. And then like, yeah, it would be like hyper sociable, like just like this kind of whirlwind of things, happenings that you had to like answer and deal with, and just doing all of that stuff and feeling really, and, you know, again, like, you know, feeling in both in New York and in Paris that you were like out in the city. I don't know how to put it, is that, you know, information was coming in, people were coming out, just like, again, the train station, like Penn Station type of model, right? Where it's just like, it's going in every single direction. You can't really keep track. And so you're just like kind of trying to figure out like how to manage it, right? And I think that with digital ethnography, I mean, one of the things that's, and I think that's why Zoe's approach, for example, is so interesting, is like, how do you kind of, you know, especially if you want to go further than just interviews, how do you, well, not mimic, but how do you kind of get an embodied experience of what it means to live on the kind of daily rhythm of content producers or influencers, etc. And I mean, I would love to hear Zoe on that, actually, because I think that's, you know, it's, for example, do you try to post videos at the same rhythms that influencers do, or like what, how do you do it? I'm just really curious.
It's funny you should ask, because I was just writing, I'm just at the moment writing this chapter for the Rutgers Companion to Media Anthropology. And actually I'm drawing on your work a lot, because it's about how content creators understand the algorithm, YouTubers specifically. And the bit I was writing today was about, I had 3 methods, but basically I interviewed content creators. I did a lot of field work, both online and offline. And then I also became a YouTuber myself. And the bit I was writing today was about becoming a YouTuber, and about how when I first started that in 2018, I tried to post 1 video a week. And I thought that was going to be like a reasonable thing to try and do. Like, as one part of my methods, I thought, you know what, I can spend a day a week filming, editing, whatever. And it was impossible. Like, it was, I did it for about 8 weeks over the summer when I had nothing else that I had to do. And then as soon as term started, it was just like, it was such a drag. And it was, anyway, it was a very interesting sort of methodological moment, because it was like,
but it's so interesting because, like, so I've been trying to do the same thing for my thing on influencers. One, like, influencer marketers that I've been working with offered me to do an internship, a virtual internship with them. And I was like, hey, you know what? I'm in New Mexico. That was like 6 months ago. And, you know, okay, yes, let's do this. Let's try this virtual internship thing. And so they were like, oh, how many hours? And I was like, oh, you know, I'm on sabbatical, like 10 hours a week. Like, sounds reasonable, right? And a month later, I like almost died of like exhaustion. And so, I mean, I think that what's really interesting is that, as you say, it was such a drag. It's like I was counting the minutes, like, on every single moment of that thing. And I was like, I have to go to 10 hours. I said 10 hours, like, you know, really. And like somehow like I was at my desk in my house, not moving, not going anywhere, but somehow like the kind of embodied emotions that I was feeling were very strong. And so that for me is kind of an example, a way in which like I'm thinking, well, you know, you can have very strong ethnographic kind of involvement through digital ethnography, which is something, honestly, I wasn't convinced of before doing it. Anyways, yeah, sorry.
It's always about, I think you're right. I completely agree. But I also think it's like, I mean, like every ethnographer knows that it's important to practice self-reflexivity and to always be aware that what you're experiencing isn't what your participants are experiencing, and that there are important differences between yourself as a researcher and your participants. But that's not to say that you can't get really useful and interesting insights from doing a practice yourself. I think we're going to move on to the open Q&A very shortly, because I see there's lots of questions, and me and Jeff have been hogging your attention for too long. But maybe just as a segue, into that, although people can ask about whatever they want. We wanted to end our conversational bit talking a bit more about methods, digital ethnographic methods specifically, and maybe you can impart some wisdom onto people in this group who are all grappling with what it means to do ethnography at the moment during a pandemic when you can't necessarily access your field. And I wonder, I mean, I'd be interested to hear more about your current research, but also I wonder, as a kind of thought experiment, if you had been doing this book, writing this book or doing the research for this book now, if you hadn't been able to go into newsrooms, how do you think you might have approached it differently?
Yeah, so I think, so it's interesting. So I think that's kind of probably the best thing about ethnographic methods is that it's flexible and that you can change and adjust, right? And that's something that I care so much about. So let me say, I say this because, again, as I said, like I was trained as a very traditional ethnographer, and, and I cared a lot, in sociology, there is this, especially this article by Gerald Mack and Can, or is it Can and Gerald Mack? I'm always getting confused. Anyway, what they say, a talk is cheap, what they say and what they do, or something like that, where basically they're like, listen, interviews are fine, but you really need, yes, please. If someone can put the link in the chat, like for everybody, you really need to triangulate. That's like the beauty of ethnographic methods is that you can triangulate stuff, right? And you don't have to take what people say at face value. You're always comparing it to another source of data about kind of the same thing and seeing how it matches or doesn't match, and kind of playing on that kind of mismatch, so to speak. And that's really kind of where I come from. It's like, I published several books in French before coming to the US, and that's what I care about. I care about finding gaps between what people say they're doing, or say who they are, what they're about, and what they're actually doing. And so I as I moved to communication and I started teaching ethnographic methods at Stanford, at first I was like, you have to do in-person field work. This is really important. I care a lot about this. I know you guys all want to do digital ethnography, but I care about you doing in-person ethnography, because you have to feel what it's like to extract data from people, and you have to feel what it's like to be out there. So it's kind of like, again, like mystique of like, kind of embodied presence, so to speak. And I think that over the years, what's really interesting is that students pushed back, and they were just like, no, like, I mean, yes and no, you're old. And I was like, okay. And basically, like, I've changed my mind. Like I really have. And so to put it differently, I think that if I were to write the book today, I would probably spend much more, kind of try to be much more creative and inventive about finding ways to be co-present online, and again, depending on the field site, it takes a lot of different kind of angles. But typically in the case of influencers, which is like, I'm in the middle of it right now, so I can't stop babbling about it. But like, so I was doing all of these interviews, and I'm doing a kind of quantitative analysis with someone else. Like I'm doing all of this, but like I was like, this is not quite enough. I need to like experience this a bit more. How do I do it, right? I haven't gone yet to the step where like I create my own channel, but like I was like, okay, so I'm gonna do this virtual internship. So I did that, and that was super intense, but I've learned a lot. And I think that in terms of like kind of getting the habitus of influencer marketers, that's been like super helpful, right? Like I've worked on media kits. I've like kind of helped in the negotiations between influencers and brands to do sponsored content. So I got a sense of like how influencers present themselves, what the negotiation looks like, what are the key metrics, like, all of that. And then I was like, okay, what else can I do? What else can I do? Like I need more. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to take all of these online classes about how to become an influencer. And so I've sat through like dozens of online classes and master classes about how to become an influencer, which was like the most, and like each time I was like, okay, to do this seriously, that's a kind of good student thing, right? To do this seriously, I have to like get a certificate at the end. So I have to do all the exercise and I need to validate the stupid classes. And so I've been spending so much time taking all of these classes, right? And so all of this to say is that I don't know, but like everything you can do to like put your body, have this kind of experience of time, have this experience of like kind of embodiment of like incorporation, you know, and whatever ways you can do this online, you know, is just wonderful. The question then is, you know, I think that we're all experimenting with this right now. And what I would love to see, and that's why I think that, you know, the LSE Digital Ethnography Collective and the Rutgers Digital Ethnography Working Group, like, and you know, there were a couple of events at Amherst and in other places about how to do fieldwork during a pandemic. I think that there is a lot of kind of knowledge sharing that, you know, should happen right now because everybody is figuring it out behind their laptop. And so, you know, and probably we're all kind of encountering somewhat similar difficulties or different but similar, and just like having these discussions in the open and publishing about it also, you know, either in peer-reviewed stuff or just like on blog posts or whatever. Here I would just like to send a shout out to Matt Raffalo and several others who've created this Slack channel called Sociologists Who Study Digital Things, which has more than 400 members now. It's sociologists in a very broad sense. We've talked some about this. It's not disciplinary specific, but like some of what we're saying is also like, yeah, people talk about what they do week to week, and you know, kind of, you know, developing more kind of information sharing about how do you do digital ethnography, right? Because I'm sure that there are things that are replicable that, you know, we can all kind of build on.
Yeah, I think that we're definitely seeing a moment. Obviously, digital ethnography has been around for a long time, like since the 90s or even the 80s, 90s, yeah. Let's say. But clearly this year and last year, people have been thinking about it more just because they can't do other types.
And so I think that there is also a lot of like, as you say, it's like, you know, there is a long tradition of digital and virtual and kind of mediated ethnography. And so making sure that like we kind of, you know, absorb this literature, that, you know, people don't ignore it. And especially, I mean, I think that one has to be very mindful here because in particular, a lot of the people who did digital ethnography in the early stages were women and, you know, people in kind of disciplines that aren't seen as prestigious as like, you know, sociology, which takes itself very seriously, or anthropology, which also takes itself very seriously, right? So I think that there is a lot to like build on and kind of rediscovering, sorry, that sounds like, you know, kind of colonialistic, but just like doing the reading and just like really diving into that tradition, which again, I think like one kind of key way of doing this is like building reading lists, basically.
Actually, I'm going to post it here in case anyone hasn't seen it. The Digital Ethnography Collective has an ongoing list that you can add to. I've just posted it in the chat, which is lengthy at this point. Shall we move on to the open Q&A? I'm aware people have been waiting for a long time. Some people asked questions a long time ago.
Yes, absolutely. So I have 6 questions lined up. If you wrote your question in the chat, I'll ask it for you, and otherwise I'll just call on you, or of course, or interrupt me if you would rather ask your own question. And otherwise, maybe you could just use the chat from here on out. So ask your question there, and then we'll proceed in order. So the first question is from David S., who, this is in relation, Angèle, to your earlier discussion when you were presenting about clickbait and how news content was getting somewhat degraded. And so he asks or wonders whether the turn from advertising revenue back to a paid or subscription model for newspapers would actually serve as a kind of corrective to the degradation of news.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's actually something like in the kind of more like kind of less methods facing kind of version of these talks. That's usually what I kind of end on, which is that, again, I mean, I think that the period that I studied, and actually it's something we talk about in our article with Caitlin Petrie, which was published in Sociologica earlier in 2020, is that, you know, we both did our fieldwork in the first half of the 2010s, which is really the moment when news websites like jumped in the chase for clicks. I mean, or were submerged by the search for clicks, but, you know, it was really a specific historical moment where suddenly advertising pressures, economic pressures, and traffic metrics kind of all came at the same time, and journalists didn't have, and editors didn't quite have the structures in place deal with it. Fast forward to 2020, 2021, the landscape is pretty different. And I agree. I mean, I think there are a couple of ways in which it's different. I mean, I think that a lot of newsrooms and news organizations have moved away from the kind of advertising-based, I mean, or purely advertising-based model, which is the two websites that I studied. They were only advertising-based. They tried to put subscriptions, but it didn't work. And in part because like even the websites that were the most aggressively traffic-driven, such as the Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, Gawker, etc., basically didn't work. It's like not really sustainable. It's really hard to sustain. And so that's what I said when I said that news organizations were moving more towards a platform kind of thing, where like suddenly they're like, oh, we have this user base that we can monetize through subscriptions, right? And so I think that, I mean, there are problems, lots of problems with it, but one of the silver linings, I would say, is that metrics become a bit more qualitative in the sense that it's not about absolute number of clicks, but it's more about retaining loyal readers and making sure that you're catering to your existing subscription base, right? And so it kind of shifts the dynamics some.
Okay, the next question is from Shobha, who asks whether you spoke to any journalists' unions as part of your study.
Yeah, I did. So mostly in the French context, where there are lots of, there is a lot of labor organizing for journalists. And there it was really interesting because, so yes, I did. What was really interesting was that in the French context especially, and also a bit in the American context, a lot of what the unions cared about when I was doing fieldwork, it has changed a bit, but a lot of what they cared about at the time was kind of financial well-being of freelancers. And so I ended up spending quite a bit of time talking with unions about that. What was kind of, it's not hilarious at all, but like in the French context, there is actually a special legislation that provides health benefits and kind of day leaves and paid leaves, etc., for freelancers, right? So there is a whole structure in place to actually help freelancers like live like, you know, to the standards that whatever they should be living. And so, but all of my kind of interactions with the unions were like, and so unions were really pushing on that. The only thing is that in order to qualify for these subsidies, you have to make at least 50% of your money from legitimate employment with registered news organizations. And none of the freelancers I talked to qualified for this. So let's just say that my interactions with the unions were on a bit of a wrong foot. Well, they were like, what do you mean they don't qualify? I was like, they don't qualify, none of them. I've asked the question to every single one of them and none of them qualifies. And they were like, they're not journalists then. I was like, oh, yes, they're journalists. Like, they're journalist bloggers, freelance journalists and bloggers, but they just don't qualify. And so anyway, but for me, kind of what was interesting there was also seeing how a lot, and you know, this is France, this is a you know, particular kind of union culture, etc. But how a lot of the frameworks that had been put in place, that's actually a framework from 1975, and basically didn't quite translate to the 2010s, right? And that unions at that time, and again, it has changed, and especially in the US, I think that there has been a lot of activism that's definitely much more, shall we say, amenable to being flexible about definitions, about who counts and who doesn't count as a legitimate worker that can be helped. But at the time, it was just like a very rigid definition. And it was just like, no one qualifies. Like, that's like, you know, not working. So anyway, but very interesting, I think.
It also really speaks to the value of your comparative work, because what it shows is that the logics and infrastructure of the union in France is not at all the same as the logics and infrastructure of the union in the American context.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, I think there is something fascinating, and right now there is a lot of coverage of that, of both the kind of freelancers union in the US and the tech worker coalition in the US, and where, like, you know, they're just doing a lot of, and I think especially obviously the tech worker coalition, just doing really important work. And like, you know, the processes of unionizing both in tech companies and in major news organizations is like really central right now, but it was not when I was doing my field work, where I think there was still very much of a disconnect between like the kind of bubbling new media ecosystem and the kind of union structures that were in place.
Thank you. Okay, the third question is from Karina Tenner, and she asks about your motivation to use the word metrics as opposed to, say, web or online analytics or statistics.
Yeah, so that's really tricky. Listen, I think, and actually I would love to know what other people are thinking. It's so funny. Yeah. So words only do what they do, right? So okay. So a couple of things. So I mean, okay. First a preface, and then I'll justify my decision. The preface is that I think that right now, when we talk about these objects that are becoming increasingly prevalent, the question of nomination is really tricky. And there is right now the same debate about algorithms, about platforms, about artificial intelligence, about data, right? It's like all of these terms are very much contested, and the disciplines or the people who study them are themselves kind of contested. It's like what are we doing? Is this critical data studies, critical algorithm studies? Do we even need the word critical? Is this really studies? Like, I mean, you know, it's so, and I think that some of this is good because it also stems from the fact that this is an interdisciplinary landscape, and where different people come with very different frameworks and kind of disciplinary backgrounds. And so, I mean, I think again that like these discussions are like an important part of like kind of figuring out what we're doing and what are the similarities. Regarding metrics and analytics, I basically kind of use both, to be honest. The problem, so my reason for focusing on metrics rather than analytics is that, as I mentioned, I was trained as a sociologist and as an economic sociologist. And there is a long literature in sociology about quantification, right? That typically talks about numbers. You know, it goes back to like whatever Mark, Zemmour, Durkheim, and all the way to like Wendy Espeland and some of her colleagues who study commensuration, rankings, etc. And I really wanted to talk to that literature. I wanted to be in yes, Theodore Porter, absolutely. I wanted to be in discussion with that literature, and in part because, and that's something that was more in my AJS papers and in the book, because I moved to communication and that wasn't as relevant, but like I think the literature on quantification is amazing and definitely what inspired me to kind of focus on metrics in the first place. But they all tend to pay attention to standardization and homogenization. And I saw that as a major blind spot of that literature, that yeah, sure, metrics standardize, that's obvious, but that's not the only work they do. They do more than that. And that's where the whole like, you know, framing metrics as symbolic objects came in. So I will say that that word of metrics is basically like a boundary object where I'm trying to talk both to the kind of digital studies people and to the kind of classical economic sociologists who've been talking about numbers for a long time. So kind of figuring out these two kind of different circles.
Thank you. The next question is from Timothy Elfenbein, and he asks if we can make a distinction between algorithmic publics and person-centered publics or influencers as they're organized by different logics and infrastructures.
Yeah, so that's such a good, you know, okay, so algorithmic publics is like, the question of publics is tricky. It's like there are like 20 different concepts that kind of do the same thing. So like network publics, calculated publics, algorithmic publics. I'm throwing my hat in the ring, like, you know, so many different publics. And then like right now, so I'm working a lot right now on the concept of community. And, you know, online communities, it's basically kind of the same. I mean, you know, you don't talk about publics, you talk about communities, but that's basically, we're talking about kind of the same thing. So what I'm trying to do there is kind of push back against the idea of like quantified audiences, right? And to kind of figure out like how these publics come together and what kind of power they yield, right? What kind of presence they have, especially when kind of represented and measured through metrics and dashboards, right? So that's really like kind of the specific thing I'm dealing with. I think that it's really interesting how I'm not so much interested in like normative definitions of publics or communities, but more about how people perceive them, right? So in that sense, it's more about like, how do other people perceive an algorithmic public? And so I guess, yeah, there is much more to unpack there. Yes, representation of publics. I think that's correct. And so that's kind of what I kind of put it in the definition and in the book as like, you know, algorithmic publics are not so much, I mean, they are mediated by algorithmic procedures, but more importantly for my purpose, they're also represented through what Karin Norsetina calls Copic systems. And, you know, typically in the case of like web journalism, it's like dashboards, like Chartbeat, right? And so I'm interested in this process of representation through metrics, analytics, etc. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do there. But yeah, it's something that I'm really thinking about, because I think that it's like the emic and ethics thing. It's like, are we talking about publics in themselves? It's like, are we talking about how people perceive and talk about publics? And I'm more interested in the second one.
Thank you. Philippa, you had a question. Philippa Chung, did you want to weigh in?
Sure. Hi, Angèle.
Yay!
Nice to see you. Thank you so much for your talk. You know, I study book reviewers, which is a type of cultural journalist. So I always learn so much. The book's out, so it's too late for me. Still, I learned. So on your point about metrics having unintended consequences, I just wanted to bring up that in my study, I'm finding that a lot of amateur book reviewers and people with blogs, but they're like not professional critics at all, they're actually able to utilize like Google traffic and stuff like that as a way to legitimate themselves, and so that they can get into professional places. So these metrics are actually being quite beneficial to them as a way of allowing people a new way to get into this historically very close group of people. But I think my question for you, and it's very related to what we're talking about, how we represent publics, is, you know, in addition to metrics actually qualifying how journalists are doing their work, I'm really interested in how having all this user data might have changed the way that people qualified and also valued their audiences beyond the fact that they could sell the data. How did it change what they thought they were doing?
This is such a good question. And I think it's such a good question in big part because, I mean, your 2 points are connected, right? So in the case of web journalists and the newsrooms I studied, I saw exactly the same thing. And that was so interesting. And both with like bloggers and people who didn't have the credentials or the experience, but also within newsrooms. So what was fascinating was that so, you know, newsrooms are unsurprisingly, you know, typically white older men on top and doing the more kind of both like top editors and doing the more prestigious sections. So that's arts and culture, politics, international news. And then typically women and people of color at the bottom doing the like less prestigious journalistic sections. So that's lifestyle, cooking, celebrities, sex, you know, all of that stuff. Now, you see where I'm going with this, which is that the less prestigious sections are also the ones that perform the best in terms of traffic. And the most prestigious sections are typically the ones that perform the least well in terms of traffic. And so basically within the newsrooms that I studied, metrics became kind of a political question about what do you value, and that's where the kind of 2 modes of evaluation, and here like very resonant with what you do, kind of come into conflict. And so typically the kind of editorial evaluation was very much used by the senior kind of editors and senior journalists who are like, oh, the chase for clicks, that's really prostitution, that's just like so degrading, this is not quality journalism. And the like young journalists, and I don't want to make them seem more heroic than they are, but there was like really important power dynamics where like, listen, there are a lot of readers out there who care about this. And they care about this because they're not being represented, they're not being heard in kind of the traditional journalistic structures. And we need to take this into account. This is not only about economic revenues, it's also about resonating with all of these readers, all of these kind of online users who care about this question. And I think that to some extent, that's also the reason why, Me Too, for example, and why like journalists right now are like, especially senior journalists with very prestigious positions are freaking out about cancel culture, is that to some extent, it's really about valuing the audience in a very different way, right? As like and kind of still like admittedly like a metricized, quantitative, like, and to some extent in most dashboards kind of economistic way, but it's still valuing the audience much more than before.
And sorry, Angèle, really quickly, is there some, so you talked about different like beats, but are there some audiences or some clicks that are just not as worthy? Like they just don't count as much?
Yeah, so that's really interesting, actually, and I have a part in the book about this. So yes and no. Basically, it depends on what kind of advertising you sell. Here I'm also looking at Melissa, but basically, you have, if you're using kind of typical run-of-the-mill like online ad delivery through like Google AdSense, then like it depends. Like there is some difference depending on the socio-demographic characteristics of users, but basically, just because it's such a massive thing, absolute numbers are what matters, right? So it's like CPM, cost per 1,000, and it's counting in like thousands of clicks, and that's like the main thing that matters. Now, if you're doing more like targeted or more like luxury kind of advertising, so typically when you see the New York Times with a big like Dior kind of whatever banner on top of the homepage, then it's very different, because then what you're selling are the socio-demographic characteristics of your readers much more than as much as their absolute numbers, right? And that, I will say kind of moving forward to influencer marketing has been taken to the next level for influencers, where really like the ways in which communities are being measured is like so specific. One thing I will say though, just for this, yes, Zoe, that's absolutely right. I will say also that like one only aspect that was really interesting was that age mattered a ton. For the journalist I talked to, which is weird because in influencer marketing, for example, age does not matter at all. It's like, but for the journalists, it really mattered, and for the editors and the marketing departments, with the idea that they wanted to renew their audience and they wanted to get young people. And the idea was that, if you hook people up when they're young, they're going to be readers of your publication for the rest of their lives. It's a bit like, music taste or something. And so you want to get them young, and that's actually a symbol of the future of the industry. Right. So that was the only exception. And so that's why also Me Too and cancel culture matter, right? Because typically the kind of young and up-and-coming like journalists were like, listen, like all the people reacting to our Me Too article are young people. We want to keep them in. We want to keep them engaged. They matter, right? So anyway, interesting tensions there.
Thank you.
The next question was technically from John, but I'm not sure if you feel it was answered, or if you want to qualify it in some way.
No, I think it was answered.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so then I'll move to the question after that, which is from Mika Rajunov, who asks, as an ethnography, did you integrate this digital data generated or used by the journalists? I'm not sure if you want, Mika, do you want to frame that a little bit?
Yeah, I'll clarify. I think it's really two questions. One is they are like producing data and looking at these metrics, and if you use any of that sort of data. But I think my bigger question is, as an ethnographer, how do you integrate all this digital co-production interaction, like my texts, my et cetera? And I think you mentioned like co-presence and what you're trying to do with the influencers, but that's something I think we're all trying to figure out. And if you can speak more to maybe non-traditional ways of doing observation or getting more of this digital data.
Yeah. I think this is a very good question. And for this, I would refer in part because, to be honest, like I don't have so many ethical qualms about it, but I should. Dana Boyd has a great paper about networked privacy If you Google Dana Boyd network privacy, you'll find it. And I also assigned it in my ethnographic method class. So, okay, so my thinking and my kind of gut reaction is that when people post super public things on social media, I can use it and it's fair game. But I know that this probably is not a very sound gut reaction. So I've been trying to think a bit differently about it. So basically, okay, so that's like, I guess raises another question, which is a question of anonymization. And I know that a lot of people have been kind of thinking about that. I've been talking a lot with, well, both with Jeff and with Forrest Stewart. Hi, I see a little one that's very cute. Hello. So my thinking is that basically, yes, I try to get access to as many internal tools as I can. So as many Slack channels, as many group chats, as many everything, like, everything I can get, Facebook groups, like, anything that I can get access to. And I'm taking screenshots like a maniac. Like I'm just taking like so many screenshots, which then like, I don't really know how to archive. So it's like, they're all like piling up, like, at some point this is going to be extremely painful. But so, I'm trying to get access to as many things as possible. In terms of using them, I haven't quite figured out everything yet. My kind of gut reaction is that if we're talking about the tweets of Donald Trump, I think that's absolutely fair game to use it. Like, this is like a publicly facing account, like whatever, like millions of people are talking about it. Like that's absolutely fine. And we can use their real name. Then there is a gray zone, right? If we're talking about like private screenshots of a private Facebook group or a private Slack channel, then I definitely anonymize, that's obvious. Then there is a gray zone in between. So for example, for like me, like, nano to micro influencers or whatever, where it is publicly available, they have a public setting. Should you anonymize, should you not? My tendency is usually to anonymize as much as I can, because I think that, but I've got a lot of pushback about this. So for example, like I anonymized the 2 publications that I studied, and a lot of people strongly disagreed with that. I stand by my decision, but all of this to say that these are like, some of these ethical questions are like complicated. And I think the best thing to do, as always about, ethical things, and I've been spending a lot of time talking to Mary Gray about this, who's been thinking about these questions much more than I have, is that, trying to think about it as a process and kind of checking in both with yourself, with your colleagues, with other ethnographers, and with people you interview and observe like regularly, to kind of check that things are okay, like, that like you're not making terrible mistakes. But it's a tricky one. I'm sorry, I had a bit of a tangent on anonymization, but it's because it's something I think about a lot about right now.
Yeah, me too. One thing I would add to that is one of the things I found super useful about doing the autoethnographic research, becoming a YouTuber, is that you get access to the back end of the platform and all the analytic data, like the equivalent of what you're talking about with in the newsrooms, and it's your data, so you can use it however you want, which is like a lot. Obviously, it's not the same as, and I have done walkthroughs with content creators where they show me the back end of their channel, which is more interesting because they have millions of views rather than like 20. But it's just, it can be with digital ethnography, like finding different ways to access different parts of websites that you don't get to see as an audience member is handy, I think.
Absolutely.
Well, the last question I have on deck is from Susan Keith. Susan, did you want to ask your question? Or?
Hi, sorry, there's piano practicing going on in my space too. So I was just interested in whether you think this pandemic moment that we're currently in has transformed these busy train station-like newsrooms that you described into something else permanently?
Yeah, that's a tough question. Let me answer a bit differently. I mean, I don't know. I think we're all in that stage of like, I don't know. This may never end. We're all going to be stuck in our living rooms for the rest of our lives. and that's okay, I guess. But you know, if I don't get the gloomy me kind of take over, I will say that one of the things that I've been thinking about and experiencing is finding. So, okay, I've always been interested in like institutions or sites where there is this train station type aspect. It's kind of what I'm interested in as an ethnographer. It's the kind of places where I like to be. And so, you know, anyway, yeah. And so what's interesting is that right now I'm finding these places online to some extent and feeling the same emotional energy, for lack of a better word, in specific like online spaces, right? So I'm thinking, for example, you know, streaming, kind of live streaming, right? Where people are just live on social media and they just receive a ton of kind of feedbacks. They kind of exchange back and forth with like hundreds of thousands of viewers, and, you know, and it feels like there is a there, right? That like, it goes beyond kind of one-to-one or one-to-many communications. That it's really like a train station. It's just like everybody's just doing their thing, and it's just like, so I've been trying to think about how to make sense of these kind of sites of collective energy online, and how they are different or not from their offline version, like the newsroom, right? And for me, what's going to be super interesting is, you know, so for example, I follow Taylor Lorenz, who is digital culture journalist at the New York Times, and she's been talking a lot about her experiences of online communities. And right now, specifically, she's using Clubhouse, which is this new social media platform, and kind of feeling about some of her experiences with harassment and kind of dealing with venture capitalists on that platform, etc. And so I mean, I guess I'm kind of curious about how journalists themselves are going to be experiencing these spaces of intense information exchange online, right? And whether these intense information exchange are more or are becoming more important than they used to be, and perhaps replacing some of the more offline kind of templates of information exchange. And I say that, you know, with a lot of I mean, I think offline exchanges have lots of good things for them, but at the same time, in the case of journalism, it's also the site of reproduction of inequality, right? And exclusion of everyone who doesn't fit that model. And so, yeah, it's a good question. And yeah. That's a very good question, and I don't know, and I hope that we can kind of have an answer to that question as soon as possible.
Are there any other questions from the floor? People can just unmute themselves and ask a question if you're feeling so inclined, or put it in the chat if you prefer. There's kind of a chat going, Angèle, right now. I don't know if you're noticing it.
Yes.
About this, again, like people taking up what you said about the ethics and who to check in with and when to check in and when to not check in, or when you feel like you're trying to get beyond the story that people are telling you that they want you to tell, and the story that you actually want to tell, which might not be the same thing.
Yeah. And so it's just like, let me just like give like one kind of specific example, because it's something that I've been thinking a lot about recently. So, so with Becca Lewis, we just had an article. So that's like my celebration. We just had an article accepted at Social Media and Society, which should come out very soon, about drama channels on YouTube and how they make sense of metrics. And so, you know, when we did the interviews, we asked them whether they wanted to be anonymized or not. And they all said, no. And that's like a big part of their ethos, right? It's like, I stand by my word. I'm true to who I am. I'm not hiding anything. I don't want to be anonymized. Okay, so we write not anonymized, and we wrote a first version of the article about without anonymizing them. Then it turns out that, you know, part of the analysis at some point is actually a second article, but is about how they rely on conspiratorial thinking, right? And conspiracy theories, and how they're just on shaky epistemological grounds with respect to like the truth, you know, it's super messy, and they're super conspiratorial. And, you know, so anyway, so we're trying to like make an intervention in the literature on whatever fake news or whatever disinformation, without centering on explicitly institutionalized politics, but instead looking at gossip channels, right? And we were like, you know, it doesn't feel right to not anonymize. It just doesn't. Like, I mean, we're saying that they're conspiracy theorists. And yes, this is an academic analysis. It's not like a response video. You know, we're not here to create drama. Like, but it does not feel right. And so eventually we just switched everything at the last minute and just anonymized everybody. Did like blanket anonymization on everything. And it's just like, yeah, it's like that's some things that kind of emerged, even though we had received approval, we had checked in with kind of IRB to make sure that we could not anonymize if people didn't want to be anonymized. And then it raises another ethical question, which is like, well, if they said they didn't want to anonymize and we're anonymizing on top of what they say, basically not taking their word seriously, is that like ethically problematic? And we decided it wasn't. So I'm happy to answer that question for you, but like, you know, but it's like, it's very tricky, I think.
Well, we'll look for that article in Social Media and Society. Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Does anyone want to just jump in with any questions with Angèle? We've done pretty well timing wise, 5 minutes to spare here. This is very good.
William, I think, had his hand raised, right? Is that correct?
But he's, yeah, do you want to go ahead, Will?
Yeah, sure, thanks. I was just mentioning I might have to run here shortly. It's a little bit later in Zurich, but thank you so much for this presentation, Angèle, and for the organizers. I wonder, as we're shifting to think about fieldwork during a pandemic and as it's lasting, whether you have a take maybe from your own current projects on whether there's a risk of like over adjusting to the pandemic conditions, and like not only in our methods, which can shift, like you can imagine like wanting to get back to like the neighborhood sites or the newsroom, but like maybe in our frameworks. And do you sense that like in the ways we're thinking about human interaction and shifts in like a journalistic field, do you see any risk of sort of over investing in our current moment and that playing out in your own work in any way?
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, I think what's really fascinating is that, you know, in the kind of long literature on like digital and virtual ethnography, I'm thinking a lot about this book on Second Life, and the name of the author escapes me right now. Anyway, yes, if someone can put it in the chat, but how Bolstorff keeps like mentioning that like physical presence is a bit overvalued, right? And that like, it's true that we put this kind of mystique also on physical presence. And I'm certainly, as someone who grew up without internet, without email address, without a smartphone, like without a cell phone even, you know, it's like certainly like I get it, you know? So I think that now we're like kind of with this kind of pandemic related circumstances, the spectrum has shifted to the kind of other side, right? Where it's just like everything's digital, everything's virtual. Yes, absolutely. Zoe is showing it. Listen, I think, you know, I think that I think that as things become more normal, we should get back to like a good middle. That's my hope. I certainly would like to get coffee with people again in my life at some point. So I'll just put it that way, but like when I can do in-person fieldwork again, I will. And so a bit more seriously, so for example, with the influencer project, my original kind of design was to kind of do all of this kind of online fieldwork and then follow up with in-person visits to some of the influencers I interviewed. And so I got approval from like 5 or 6 of them. And each time I asked if I could spend 5 or 6 days with them and figure out, just like see how they publish videos, kind of follow them in their daily routines, and basically saying like, listen, it's for 5 days. Like, yeah, I'm going to be a bit of a pain in the butt, but like, you know, it's only for 5 days. And actually most of them agreed. So I have visits planned, I mean, you know, in a future world to like Toronto, Thailand, the Netherlands and Mexico to go see influencers. And all of this I negotiated all of this in March 2020. So, you know, none of this happened. But eventually, wow. I mean, I think that, you know, yeah, I think that doing in-person fieldwork with influencers, again, to see how they kind of navigate, you know, because there is so much you don't see, right? It's like how they create a video, what goes, and just like some of it also is just asking questions, sitting, you know, side by side with someone and asking questions about what they're doing. Just like you realize that you really only know 10% of why they're doing what they're doing. So you know, I think eventually, I mean, again, I come from a world where I think in-person fieldwork is super important, and I hope I will return to some version of that world eventually.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we do not need to do any digital ethnographic fieldwork to know that we are all looking forward to getting back to some kind of in-person something as soon as possible. Let me take this opportunity to thank Angèle Christin for coming to speak with us today. It was so great, so useful. Like, I took 9,000 pages of notes. I'm sure I'm not the only one. Really, really great. Yes, please.
I'm so grateful, first of all, that, you know, you all organized this, and now I just wish like we could do the same thing for every single person in the room, right? It's like I want to know what everybody's working on. I mean, so perhaps I just conclude with a last call to join sociologists who study digital things, because it is a good, I mean, community again is a heavy word, but like it is a good community. And like a lot of students trying to. And young scholars trying to help each other out and you know, just be in this together as much as possible.
And please do follow, you know, Zoe and her co-organizer of the LSE Digital Ethnography Collective, and Jeff's and my group at Rutgers, DEWG. I mean, there are many others, that really far from the only one. So yeah, please do, let's keep this community going as much as possible and see how many more of these we can do, because they're obviously so valuable to all of us.
So many.
Yeah. Yes.
And we kind of dropped the ball. This is the first event that we've run since the COVID started. And now I'm going on maternity leave, but we have plans to run more, and we'll still be here.
Hey, you know, Zoe, like you could bring the baby.
Yeah, I know.
At the beginning, they sleep a lot, right?
Yeah, actually, we have an event in April with Veronica Barassi that I'll come to with like a 1-month-old baby, I think.
Oh my gosh.
Fantastic. We have one coming up in about a month, not even a month's time, I think in a few weeks' time, with Claudio Benzicri, who's also going to talk about moving basically from your digital data onto the page. What do you do with all your data once you've got it collected? So we have a few more coming up, and we'll heavily publicize it through our networks too. So
stay tuned for that.
But thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much, Angèle. That was really, really wonderful.
This is so cool. I just, listen, like this is the best, this is the best group possible. And I'm so glad also to see that people are thinking about this. And again, like digital technologies are great and awful at the same time, and all of both, but I'm just, this is a silver lining, getting to kind of meet everybody in this kind of discussions is just really priceless. So yeah,
agreed.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, back to my suitcases.
Back to the books.
Thanks
everybody. Thank you so much.
Bye.
And for being so active in the chat.
Yeah, that was a great chat. Thanks, everybody.
Very good. Cool. Lovely.
That was really great. Thank you, guys. Thanks, Zoe and Jeff. Thanks. That was so interesting and great questions. And
thanks for organizing us along in this conversation and keeping us on track with the questions. That was great.
Yeah, good job. It's much easier with 3 people, isn't it? It's like it's really it's like when I've done a couple of events where I had to run them on my own.
All the boy family's in full effect here.
Yeah.
Hi, people.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
Oh, bye.
Bye.